As we continue now with our study of the core ideas that make up what we call Reformed theology, I think of an event that took place in history just a couple of years before the Pilgrims landed on the shores of New England in the Mayflower. A controversy that spread throughout Europe and then around the world that had its roots in the Netherlands. It began in a theological faculty of a Dutch institution that was committed to Calvinistic theology. When some of the professors began to have second thoughts about issues relating to the doctrine of election and predestination and that sort of thing, and this theological controversy erupted, and as it spread across the country, it upset the church and it upset the theologians of the day until finally a synod was convened and issues were squared away and certain people were rejected in their views, among whom was a man by the name of Arminius. But the group who led this movement against Orthodox Reformed theology were called the Remonstrants. They were called the Remonstrants because they were remonstrating or protesting against certain doctrines within their own theological heritage. And there were basically 5 doctrines that were the core of the controversy. And what has happened as a result of this debate is that these 5 core theological issues became known in subsequent generations as the so-called 5 points of Calvinism. And they are known through the very popular acrostic TULIP, T-U-L-I-P, which is a sort of clever way to sum up the 5 articles that were in such dispute. And I mentioned that historical event for this reason. As we've said all along, it would be a serious mistake to understand the essence of Reformed theology simply in light of these 5 doctrines, because the Reformed faith involves many, many, many other elements of theological and ecclesiastical confession. But these are the 5 controversial points of Reformed theology, and they're the ones that are popularly seen as being distinctive to this particular confession. So we're going to spend some time looking at the 5 points of Calvinism as they are spelled out in this acrostic. And we remember that this acrostic, tulips, uses the first letter of 5 different doctrines. The first is total depravity, hence the T. And the second is unconditional election, and hence the U. The L stands for limited atonement. The I for irresistible grace, and P for the perseverance of the saints. And when I have lectured on these doctrines in the past, I have stated one or more objections to these subheadings as defining the doctrines, because many of them, if not all of them, are somewhat misleading. But they fit so nicely into this acrostic, people insist on using these abbreviations to define the 5 points. And so what we're going to do today is begin with a brief overview of the T of the tulip, that which stands for total depravity. I remember many, many years ago I was teaching a course in theology at a college, and the students who were enrolled in the college did not come from a Reformed background by any means, and we were working through various doctrines, and I came to the doctrine of total depravity. And I gave an exposition that went over about a week of classes, and at the end of that time I asked the students if they were persuaded that this indeed was the biblical view of human sinfulness. And everybody in the class raised their hand and indicated, yes, they were convinced that this was the correct biblical view. And I said, are you sure? And they said, yes, they're absolutely sure. So I went on the blackboard, on the top left-hand side of the blackboard, and I wrote a number there, the number of the students there, like 28 students, put it in a box, and I wrote next to it for the janitor, please do not erase. And I did that for a reason, but they were all committed. And then the next week we started in on the U of unconditional election, and there were howls of protest from the students who rebelled against that doctrine. They didn't like that at all. And when I began to press them on the doctrine, I said, now, are you sure you still want to subscribe to total depravity as you did last week? And one by one I had to erase the names up there in the left-hand corner of the blackboard. And I say that for this reason, that there's one sense in which if a person really embraces what is called the doctrine of total depravity, the other 4 points in this 5-point system more or less fall in line. They become duck soup and corollaries, more or less, of this first point. And so let's take some time to look at that. The historical situation where this doctrine first became a matter of great import and great controversy was early on in church history during the teaching ministry of St. Augustine. And I'm sure you've heard a little bit about the so-called Pelagian controversy of the latter part of the 4th century and into the 5th century, which began when this British monk, whose name was Pelagius, protested against a statement that was in one of the written prayers of Augustine, wherein in this prayer Augustine made this comment before God. He said, O God, command what thou wouldst and grant what thou dost command. Let me say it again. Command what thou wouldst and grant what thou dost command. And of course, Pelagius had apoplexy over this prayer. Now, the reason for his displeasure was not the first part of the prayer, wherein Augustine said, O God, command whatever you want to command. Pelagius, being a pious monk, certainly agreed with Augustine that God had every right to exercise his authority over the creatures and to command what's deemed pleasing to him. But what exercised Pelagius was the second part of the prayer, when Augustine asked God to grant what he commands. Because Pelagius said that assumes that the creature somehow is not morally able to do the will of God. And so that created a lengthy controversy, frankly, which controversy goes on even to this day. And we continue to have discussions about Pelagianism or semi-Pelagianism, Augustinianism, and so on. In fact, I just finished writing a book about the entire historical development of that controversy from Pelagius down to last week. And so I will be going into that in much greater detail later on, where I hope to have a separate course just on that question. But by way of introduction and overview, the issue has to do with the question of original sin. And the doctrine of total depravity reflects